Welcome into the midweek mailbag show presented to you by Fantasy Points. My name is Nick Skrip. I am your host on this show every single week where I take community questions and answer them here. I either take those questions from Twitter or our Fantasy Points Discord. A great incentive to signing up for fantasypoints.com and being a subscriber is being part of that Discord, not just to get your questions answered, but the Fantasy Points staff are in there on a daily basis answering questions and interacting with the subscribers. So all the questions today actually do come from the Discord. I'm getting situated here. I got a different studio today. All the questions do come from Discord, and we'll kick things off with Juju, who asks, what sort of value can we find on tanking teams this late in the year? So this is a dynasty question looking to address, hey, there's teams that are out of it completely. Maybe they're rebuilding. Maybe they just weren't competitive. What can we look for if we want to trade those specific teams? And one important factor is the state of your team when answering this question, because you may also be in some sort of a rebuild where maybe you're not a contender this year, but you're trying to shape your team to be a contender in Dynasty in the future, or you are a contender, meaning that you feel like you have a chance of actually winning your Dynasty league this season. So two different sort of targets, and here are some examples here. So here are some contender targets from the bottom teams or teams that might be in a rebuild or tanking teams. Keenan Allen, finally healthy after missing most of the year, which turned off a lot of people because of his age. He hasn't historically missed a ton of games, but people look and see a 30-year-old wide receiver and see he missed a ton of games and start thinking that he's washed or old or injury prone and those things. But his first game back, 94 receiving yards, a touchdown last week, 5 straight seasons. Before this, he's been a top 15 option, with 4 of those being a top 12 option, a.k.a. wide receiver 1. DeAndre Hopkins, probably a bit more expensive than Keenan Allen because he's been lighting it up since he's been back. 5 out of 6 of his games since his return from suspension have been above 18 fantasy points. 4 of those 6 were wide receiver 1 weeks. Hollywood Brown did just out-target him this past week, but just seeing how solid he's been for fantasy, he might be a bit harder to actually go and trade for, but he's 30. So people might be starting to think like, hey, will his decline start happening come next season? 3 down weeks now for Mike Evans, but the volume is still there. 85 targets in 10 games. He's also a little bit older, 29 years old. A guy that I feel like is going to consistently be targeted and see the production that we've seen from Mike Evans in the past, but he's had down weeks. So again, teams that are not contending right now might say, hey, this guy's getting older. He's not looking great right now. A ton of people want to cut ties with Zeke. Definitely risk there, especially with him splitting worth with Tony Pollard. But he's been over 16 fantasy points the last 2 weeks, and it's not going to cost you what Derrick Henry would cost you, even though they're similar in age. So the point with the contender targets is, look for aging veterans being productive, that you can check on their price, because there might be this thought that those rebuilding or tanking teams want to move on from those guys. So if you're also rebuilding and you want to look at some values from those tanking teams, you kind of have to capitalize on down weeks and changes of outlooks. Justin Fields in Superflex and one quarterback leagues, his price is still probably very high, but if he continues to sit out, or if he gets shut down this season, his hot streak would have been in the past, and everybody else is focusing on other guys on Sundays, right? So due to him not playing potentially or sitting another week, you might be able to sneak in there and get him for a different value in comparison to what he would have been costing you those hot weeks where he was just lighting the fantasy world on fire. Jahan Dotson is a rookie I still have a ton of faith in the long run for. I believe in the talent. I liked him coming out of Penn State. He opened up the season really, really good. He was scoring touchdowns, had some great fantasy point weeks over expectations, but then he got hurt and missed a bunch of games. And since being back with Taylor Heineke, hasn't really been that great. So again, dynasty, long run, talents there. We've seen some production. Jahan Dotson's a good target for me. If you believe in Dameon Pierce, I know there's a lot of polarizing opinions on him, but if you believe in him, he has not scored 14 fantasy points since week 8. He's been under 5 fantasy points in his last 2. So he might have had a value dip If you like Deontay Johnson, another polarizing player, he's been disappointing. He was just a top 10 wide receiver last season, though. If days in Pittsburgh are going to be better, you would hope that it would be better for him as well. Drake London, Kyle Pitts, the volume for the Atlanta Falcons has not been great in terms of how much they're passing the ball and how little they are actually focusing in on their top two guys. Drake London's had some splash plays. He was a great prospect out of USC. As the volume changes in the future, now would be the time to go get him. Kyle Pitts has had a really disappointing season versus expectation, and he's now on the IR. So, again, you can capitalize on that. So, another thing, I'm going to throw it out there. If you're like a totally fantasy degenerate here, like a lot of us are, like I am, you can look at the upcoming free agency pool. Who are guys that are going to be free agents that might land in a better spot or a better situation than they are right now? Who are some guys that have other teammates that might not be in the team next year and can open up an opportunity for them? So you can usually just Google 2023 free agents and take a look that route. But again, for this whole question, got to take a look at those tanking teams and, figure out if you are a contender or a rebuilding team, or maybe you're something, in the middle. And a lot of dynasty trade deadlines have either not happened or don't happen because there isn't one. It's a lot different than a redraft. Next question, Demont asks Jay Chase, so Jamar Chase and rostering in week 13, floor, ceiling. So Jamar Chase is expected to return from his hip injury. Reports suggested he was actually very close in week 12, which is an even better sign for week 13 because they may have been cautious with him versus forcing him into the mix and maybe him getting re-injured or being a bit sore or banged up from that week 12 game. So he had that extra week of rest, which is a bit better looking at this specific week coming up. He's been out since week 7. Wide receiver 4, weeks 1 through 7. In the games he did play, he averaged 20.2 fantasy points. He had the second most targets, 6th most receiving yards, and tied for the most receiving touchdowns during that 1 through 7 span. Weeks 2 through 5, he scored a max of 12.1 fantasy points, with the lowest of that being 10.8. So he's definitely not, like bust-proof or bulletproof, when it comes to his actual production. We've seen some down weeks, but you got to look at the upside he brings. He did score 28.9 week 1, 32 week 6, 33 week 7. So we know the upside is there. It's evident through those games. It's evident through all of those games mentioned being above 129 receiving yards. So to sum it up, if Jamar Chase plays and you roster him, you play him. And again, nothing is guaranteed. Guys bust all the time, but we've seen the upside. We've seen the production. Second year player that has been just great for fantasy. So if you have him, you play him. Next question, X gonna give it to I love this. I love that name. That is a great play on words right there. I'm gonna have to steal that for a league one year. But for fantasy playoffs, would you stash any of these defenses? Denver, Tennessee, Cleveland, Kansas City, or would you just stream? So a lot of teams that maybe have solidified their spot in the playoffs, maybe they're the 1 seed, maybe they're comfortable with their team rest of the season, that they feel like they're going to have that spot. They're looking at the fantasy playoffs, especially if you are a team that streams maybe a defense or a kicker or a tight end. Looking at this group of defenses and special teams mentioned, we're going to look at weeks 15, 16, and 17. So Denver gets the Cardinals, the Rams, the Chiefs. The Titans get the Chargers, the Texans, the Cowboys. The Browns get the Ravens, the Saints, and the Commanders. The Chiefs get the Texans, the Seahawks, and the Broncos. So based off of that, Kansas City clearly stands out to me. Maybe not the best play this specific week because they do play Cincinnati, but they do have Denver in week 14 just before the fantasy playoffs, Denver being the team they also play week 17. They're coming off of 2 good games against the Chargers and the Rams, 8 sacks and 3 interceptions in those 2 games combined. Obviously, Matthew Stafford was not the quarterback in the Rams game, but defense is still out there performing. Denver, who they play week 14 and then championship week, if you can get there, is scoring the least points per game on offense. Houston is scoring the second least points per game on offense. So we have this sandwich of 15, 16, 17, 15, and 17 being the best two possible matchups in terms of what the offense is scoring per game on the low end. Seattle, not going to lie, is a tougher matchup. Geno Smith, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Kenneth Walker, those guys have been performing well. But I feel like it's hard to pass up just knowing that week 14, you get Denver, week 17, you get Denver, and then week 15, you get Houston. So Kansas City Chiefs, I think, are a great stash for the rest of the season here. Next question, Albert Lemon. Is the Love hype justified? So Jordan Love, backup quarterback for the Packers. Chicago this week seems like a good matchup. Assuming Rodgers isn't ruled out, Aaron Rodgers, you still risk starting either Love or Rodgers? Question mark. So Chicago gives up the 14th most points per game to quarterbacks on the season. So I guess it's on the better end of matchups, but it's like near the middle. I don't think it's as good of a matchup for quarterbacks as people maybe think it is, just because Chicago isn't the best team this year. If you are uncomfortable with either starting Jordan Love, if he is the starting quarterback, and again, I've been checked out since earlier today, and today is Tuesday, so be sure to check up on the news. But if Jordan Love is a starter, you're not comfortable. If Aaron Rodgers is the starter and you're worried he's going to be limited, here are some other quarterbacks that could be available in your league. They are available to these percentages in sleeper redraft leagues. So Marcus Mariota, rostered in 46.6% of sleeper leagues. He's the QB 10 right now, and he's averaging 16.18 fantasy points per game. He plays the Steelers, giving up the 7th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Good matchup. He's been performing well. Trevor Lawrence, he's rostered in more leagues, but he's still under 60% rostered on sleeper as of Tuesday. He's had back-to-back weeks of over 20 fantasy points, and he plays the Lions, who give up the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So a guy who has been pretty hot the last 2 games, phenomenal matchup, the best matchup for quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points per game. Jared Goff, same matchup. Not as good as these other two, but he is coming off of a 17-point week. He plays the Jaguars, giving up the 8th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So just naming a few guys there, they might be available in your league. I might, pivot and just take a quarterback that has shown to perform well for the fantasy world and has a good matchup this week. And you can dig a little bit deeper than what I did, but those are just some examples with the point present in that. Last question here. I'm going to butcher this. Sansuchi.eth. I said it wrong for sure. So my apologies, but I appreciate the question. But is Alvin Kamara not startable until week 15? So following an explosive 42.8 fantasy point week in week 8, how non-Kamara has Kamara been, you ask? Weeks 9 through 12, he's been the running back 29 overall, averaging 9.2 fantasy points per game. Not very Kamara-like. He hit the medical tent last week, week 12, and he had 2 costly fumbles to ice that cake. So hasn't been great for Alvin Kamara. Now you have to pay attention to make sure he is healthy going into this week. These questions are always highly dependent on what your roster looks like and the depth that you have for the running back position. Maybe on one side, just as an example, maybe you're a guy that drafted Kenneth Walker late in redraft. Maybe you drafted Ramondre Stevenson late. Maybe you drafted Jeff Wilson super late or picked him up off of waivers. So if you have a couple guys that have been overproducing versus what the cost was in your drafts, maybe you're deeper than some other people. Some of those other people might be managers that might have drafted Kamara, but also drafted like Breece Hall or Javonte Williams somehow in our thin at the position. So, in the case that you're pretty deep, if you want to fade for a week, that's fine. Pay attention to the injury news. But I will say the first 2 games in the fantasy matchup, the fantasy playoffs, Kamara does draw 2 very good teams in terms of points per game given up to the running back position. He draws Atlanta first. Great matchup for running backs. And then he draws Cleveland. Both are top 10 in fantasy points per game given up to running backs. So dependent on who else you roster, if you want to sit him in week 13, week 14, so be it. But just keep in mind, week 8, you saw what he can do, right? You saw the upside of Alvin Kamara as a dual threat running back. So you'll be taking that chance. But again, it just depends on what your options are. But in the fantasy playoffs, you are playing him. If he's healthy, you play Alvin Kamara. That'll do it for today, guys. Thank you for the questions. Make sure if you've seen this podcast, you are a subscriber of fantasypoints.com. Use the promo code P2W22 for a discount. Good luck this week.